Alright, so I'm going to do the project from Chapter 3 here, which is really all about intents. I'm going to try and make this video shorter and more concise than the last one, so hopefully it doesn't run long like the last one did for Chapter 2. But this one is all about intents. And intents are one of the core features of Android, and they're used to pass data around between activities. And you can start activities using an intent, which is what we're going to do in this project. You can start an activity in the same app that you're in, or you can actually start a new application. You can start an activity in a new application with an intent. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But one of the really cool things about Android is that your applications can be integrated. So if I needed to pull up a web page from an activity in my application, I could launch an intent. They call it launching the intent. I could launch an intent, and then Android would start the browser application for me and pull up the web page for me, and then I could actually go back to my application after that if I wanted to. So if I wanted to show a web page in my app, I wouldn't have to code a whole browser scheme. I could just use the browser app that's already installed on Android. And this is a concept that kind of took me a while to understand when I was first learning about Android, but once you get it, it makes it, you can see how the whole operating system and all the applications can be tightly integrated, which can save you a lot of coding. So you can just use other apps that are already have already been created. So I'm just going to follow along the steps for Chapter 3 here. So I'm going to create a new project here. And they want us to call this one Messenger. Now I've already created this once, so I'm going to call mine Messenger 2. But you can call yours Messenger. And then I'll hit Next here. And I know you can hardly see my Next button down at the bottom, but now we're going to use API level 15. That's going to be the minimum that we support. So I'll hit Next here, and we're going to just use the default, the blank activity. So I'll hit Next again, and they want us to change the first activity's name from main. Usually the main activity in an application is called main activity, but they want us to change it to create message. So what we're going to do is create an intent, which is, I guess you can think of it as a message, but what it really is it's called an intent. So anyways, just make that change into this line, and then you can go ahead and hit finish. And now it's going to take Android Studio a little while to build all these files. And that wasn't so bad. That was pretty quick actually. So here's our new project. So this is my new project, and it defaults to showing the layout file, activity underscore create underscore message.xml, and Android Studio just by default puts a text view in it that says hello world. So we're supposed to delete this. We'll get rid of that, and we're going to place some code from page 76 in the book in here. So I've copied the code into the layout file, which is basically just a button and an edit text control. An edit text control is really just an input box. So the user of the app can type in text into it. We all know what a button is. You don't have to worry too much about these attributes here. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But what I do want you to note is the onClick attribute is set to onSendMessage, and that's going to be a method that gets called in the activity that goes with this layout file when this button is clicked. The other thing that I want to point out, and you can see this is in red here, it's hard for me to see because I'm colorblind, but it's red here because there's an error. It's saying that the text or the label inside the button should use a string resource named send. But we haven't created that yet, so that's why it's in red. It's flashing an error. So let's go over to the values folder in the strings.xml file, and we'll add that string resource. So add a new string. The name they have us use is called send, and the value is going to be send message. So what we're going to see in that button is this send message. That's what will appear in the user interface. So I'll go ahead and save that. Go back to my layout file, and you can see that this is now green. So it found the string resource. Let's check out the activity that we've created that goes with this layout file. Now in the book I think they tell you can delete everything except for the onCreate method, but I don't delete it, I just kind of move it out of the way. We don't have to worry about it. We'll get into those methods a little bit later, but the one that you do need to worry about, the important one right now at least, is this onCreate method. Now that method gets called by Android right when this activity is about to come onto the screen. And what I want to point out here is that there's this method call here. So this is the set content view method of the activity class. What it's doing here is it's matching this activity with the layout. So it's specifying the layout right here, and that's the file that we were just in. So I wanted to point this out because it's easy to overlook, because Android Studio creates this code for us. But it's really important to note that this is required in activities, that you have to match a layout file with it. And now when I was working in Android in Eclipse, we had to type this in manually, so we were very aware of it. But in Android Studio, since it generates the code, you kind of forget about it, but it's important to know what's going on. So anyways, let's go create that method that gets called when the button gets clicked. Now when you have a click handler method, it has to follow some certain guidelines. It has to be public, it has to have a void return type, and we called it on send message. That's the name we specified in, what did I do here? In the layout file. Whoops. On send message. How did I, let's see, what did we call it here? With an A. Okay. And it has to have a parameter that's of type view. So what is this view parameter? I think we talked about this in the last video. But when the button gets clicked on by the user, Android will call this method, because this is what we set the onClick attribute to, and it will pass in a view. So Android is calling this method for us, and Android is passing in this parameter for us. But what is this view? The view is actually the button that gets clicked, and this can come in handy sometimes. We're not going to actually use it in this chapter, but we'll see in the future why that can be useful. So the other thing is, it's saying that it can't resolve the symbol view. That's because we haven't imported it yet. So if I hit Alt-Enter here, that should import it, and then we should be good to go and no red. So if I expand my imports here, you can see that the view has been imported for us. So we're going to leave this blank right now with no code inside of it, and I think the next step is for us to create the activity that we're going to transition to in this app. And then what we'll do is we'll come back to this and we'll create an intent, which the book kind of refers to as a message, but I'd rather have you think of it as what it is, which is called an intent. And we'll transition from this activity to the other activity. So let's go ahead and create that other activity right now. So I go up here to File, New, Activity, and we'll just use a blank activity. And they want us to call this Receive Message Activity. I think that's all we need here. So I'll go ahead and hit Finish. I don't know if you can see the Finish button down there. And we can see now it's showing us the layout file for the activity that we just created. So I want to point out that we specified creating a new activity, but it also created a layout file for that activity too. So if I go into the Java folder here and open up our package, you can see that here's the new receive message activity that we created, and Android Studio also created a layout file to go with it. And the other thing that's really important is that anytime you add an activity to your application, you have to register it in the manifest file. And the manifest file, I think we've talked about this, is like a configuration file for your application. So I'm going to go up here to the manifests folder and then open up the Android manifest.xml file. And now this is another thing that Android Studio does that Eclipse didn't do, is when we created the activity in Android Studio, it actually registered it for us. So here's the code right here. This Android Studio put this in there for us. Now in Eclipse we had to do this manually. In some ways I like that better because you know what's going on when you have to do it manually. There's a lot of magic happening under the hood with Android Studio, which can be really confusing for beginners. So and here's another thing that tripped me up a little bit here too, is this label. Now it's saying receive message activity. Another thing that Android did when we created the activity is it added a string resource to the strings file for us. So if I hover over this, this is another thing that Android Studio does that's different than Eclipse's. So it's not showing us the code, it's showing us the value of the string resource. But when I hover over it, you can see what the actual code is. So now that I click on it, it shows me the actual code and not the value of the string resource. So anyways, this is the real code right here. Try not to get confused by that. But if I go back over to the strings XML file and open that up, you can see that Android Studio created another entry into the strings file, and it called it title activity receive message. And if I go back into the manifest file one more time, you can see that it's referring to that string resource, title activity receive message. So it can be a little bit confusing because there's a lot of stuff happening automatically for us. And like I said, when I was learning Android, we had to type in all the code ourselves, which made it a little bit easier to understand what was going on. All right, so we've got our other activity created, and the next thing that we need to do is to set up an intent that will launch this receive message activity. So I'm going to go back over to the create message activity file, and we're going to create a new intent here in this onSend message method. So before we actually launch an intent, we have to create the intent. So I'm going to create an intent here. So I'll call the constructor for the intent class equals new intent, and there's two parameters that we're going to pass into the constructor. This, which is referring to this class, which is the create message activity, and now you have to, this is called passing the context around, and we'll talk about this more in the future, but you'll see this a lot where you have to pass this around. So what it is that we're passing around is this activity itself, and that's so that Android knows where the intent was launched from. But you'll see this in other cases in Android too, where you have to pass what's known as the context, because an activity is a subclass of the context class, and a lot of times Android needs to know the context of where the intent came from. So the second parameter that we're going to pass in here is going to be our receive message activity. So we're going to type in receive message activity and then class. So it's going to actually call the constructor for us and then call the onCreate method of the receive message activity here. We're just specifying the class to create an instance of in this second parameter. a little bit confusing, but we'll see it enough in the future that it'll just become second nature to us. Now it's saying that I need to import the intent class here, so I'm going to hit Alt and Enter there, and that should fix that. And now we've created our intent, and we've given it the information that it needs, the context and the activity that we want to launch. And now we need to actually launch it. And to launch it, we use the start activity method of the activity class. Start activity, and then we pass it the intent that we just created. So when we call this method, the Android operating system will analyze the intent and figure out what to do. And in this case, it'll see that we're trying to launch this receive message activity. And I just want to point out quickly that if we hadn't registered this receive message activity in the manifest file, when this code runs, we would get a runtime error because it wouldn't be able to find the activity. So we always have to register our activities in the manifest file when we create new ones. And Android Studio, unlike Eclipse, does that for us. So at this point we're ready to run the app, so I'm going to run it, and then I'm going to pause my screen capture because it's going to take a long time for my emulator to fire up, but I'll just hit the run button here, and then we've seen this before, but I'll be prompted to choose an emulator, and I'm just going to hit pause while that whole process takes place just to save some time for you guys. So after a moment or two, I'm now seeing this screen right here, and it's asking me to choose the emulator. Now I've created a bunch of emulators. You guys have maybe only created one, but the one that I want to use now is this Nexus 5 API 21 x86 that I created. So I'll hit OK, and then I'll have to wait a little bit while it fires up the emulator, and then hopefully I should see my app. So I'm going to pause it while that happens. Alright, so that took a few minutes, but my emulator is up now, and I realized that the bottom of it's clipped for you guys. I'm actually working on my laptop at home, and I don't have a bigger monitor or a second monitor. But anyways, the emulator is up and running. I'm just going to unlock it by dragging up from the bottom of the screen, and I should see my app here. Okay, so here's our button, and here's our edit text right here. Now we're not actually doing anything with the edit text right now, but we will in the second phase of this. So if I go ahead and click on this button, hopefully we'll see the second activity get launched. And there we go. So that worked. So we can see here, this is our receive message activity. That's the label from that manifest file. And if I hit the back button here, which you can't see, which I can't show you right now, but I hit the back button on the emulator to go back to this message, to this activity. So I'm going to start working on the next phase of this project, but I want to point out that I'm going to leave my emulator up and running. I'm just going to minimize it. That way, the next time I want to run the app from Android Studio, I don't have to wait for it to fire up the emulator. I'm just going to minimize it and leave it down in the system tray while I work on the next phase of the project. So the next phase is to actually send some information in that intent so that we can pass data around between our activities. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but I kind of think of these intents, if any of you have ever done web development, as events. And actually events occur in lots of other languages, but I'm thinking of JavaScript and how you can listen for events to happen in the browser. So the browser has all these events that are happening all the time, like onload and unload, and when a button is clicked. So the browser actually generates these events, and the browser actually calls the methods for us that we specify. So if you've ever done web development, you can think of these intents as events in JavaScript or whatever other language uses events, and a lot of them do. So what we need to do now is stuff some information into this intent. And what we're going to do here is we're going to use that edit text view from our create message activity to allow the user to create some text, and we'll send that text to the receive message activity. But before we do that, we're going to make an adjustment to the layout file for the receive message activity. So I'm going to go over to activity receive message XML over here. I'll click on that, and they want us to, we can use this text view here, but we don't want it to say hello world. We're just going to get rid of that. Whoops. What we want it to say, we want the text to be, we'll leave it blank right now, so I'm just going to delete it. So there won't be any label in this text view anymore. But we're going to need to get a handle on this text view from the activity, from the receive message activity. So we need to, in order to get a handle on it so that we can work with it from the activity, we need to give it an ID here. So we'll give it Android ID equals @ ID, and then we'll give it an ID of message. And again, I think I complained about the naming conventions that the book uses. I'm used to something totally different, so but I think it's confusing if I change it up on you. So I'll just go with what the book has here. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And the next step is to go back over to our create message activity and put some information inside of the intent. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab information from the edit text view that is in the layout file that goes with this activity. So let's take a look at the layout file again that goes with this create message activity. Here's the edit text, and you can see that the ID is called message. So that's what we're going to use to get a handle on it from our create message activity. So, and we do it like this. So we make a string variable, a variable of a string data type, and they call it message text equals, whoops, let me start over here. First we want to get a handle on that edit text. So we'll make a variable of the edit text type, and they call it message view. I would call it something else here. Edit text. We've seen this before. This is another really important method, find view by ID, and we use it to get a handle on a UI control from the layout file that goes with this activity. And I'm not sure how well we've discussed what this r.id thing is. We got into it in Chapter 2 a little bit, but if it's still a bit fuzzy, don't worry about it. I might give you an assignment or make a video that helps to clarify that. So I need to fix my imports here, so I'm going to hit Control or Alt Enter, and that should import. Actually, I have to put my cursor over that edit text and then hit Alt Enter, and then choose import class here, so that'll import the edit text class for us. So now we have a variable named message view, and it's going to hold our edit text control, and we want to pull whatever the user entered into that edit text and stuff that into our intent. So let's get that, whatever they entered. We'll create a string variable, string message text is what they call it, and we'll grab it from that message view, and it's just get text, and for some reason we have to call toString on it, because I suppose it may not, that message view get text maybe doesn't return a string. Let's see what it returns actually. So if I hover over this here, So if I put my cursor over this get text method, and I right click and I say go to declaration, hopefully you guys can see this. I can see here's the declaration for that method, and so it's saying that the return type is an editable object, not a string. So I'm not exactly sure what an editable object is. We could do a little bit of research on it, but it looks like we can convert it to a string pretty easily. So I'm just going to close that, and so we just call the toString method of that editable object that gets returned, and that's what we need to do to actually pull that value out of the edit text that the user enters. And the next thing we need to do is to stuff that value into the intent. So we can now putting values inside of intents, they call those values extras. So if I do intent dot put extra, you can see this is overloaded here. There's lots of versions of it, and we're going to stuff a string into it. So the one that we're going to be using is going to be way down here, this one. And the book, you could just hard code a string like this, like my message. So this is actually these extras are hash maps. They're key value pairs. So you could make whatever you want to be the key here. So I could put anything in here. I could just call this X if I wanted to, and then the value that we're going to pass in is that message text that we pulled out of the edit text view. So this would be fine, and it wouldn't cause any problems if I just put this string in here. This could be anything, but what I have to remember is in the receiving activity, the one that we're passing this intent to, you would have to do the same thing to get the intent out of it, so which can cause bugs. So what they're doing in the book is they're going to create a static variable inside the message activity class. It's actually a static constant, and then we'll use that so that we don't have to worry about making sure that whatever we pass in here matches when we try and pull the values out of the intent. So this is going to cause an error right now because we haven't created the static variable yet, but it's going to be receive message activity, and they call it extra message. Now we haven't created this extra message yet, so it's going to be red. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I just saved it first. Save the file, that is, and then I'm going to go over to the receive message activity. So the first thing we're going to do in here is we're going to create that static constant. So it's public static final extra underscore message equals, now this can be pretty much whatever we want. It could be that X that I put in there before, but they use message in the book. Oh, I forgot to specify that it's a string, so I need to add string in here. Okay, so everything looks good there. I'll come back to this in a second. Hopefully I'm not over talking it to death here. And what we need to do now is when this activity gets started, it's going to Android is going to give it the intent that was used to create it. And so once we get that intent, we can pull the data out of it. So here we're going to do that in the onCreate. Now remember, onCreate gets called when this activity gets created. So the other activity, create message activity, is going to launch the intent, and then Android's going to look at the intent, and it's going to see that the intent is specifying that we want to start this activity. So Android will call the constructor for this activity, and then Android will actually call the onCreate method, and you can see that this takes a parameter called a bundle. Now that's another way you can pass data around, but Android also creates or passes the intent into this activity as well, and we can get it like this. It's real easy. You just call get intent. So get intent is a method of the activity class. So I'm going to create an intent variable here, a variable of the intent data type equals get intent, just like that. And now we need to import the intent class, so I'm going to hit Alt Enter. So this is how we get to that intent that launched this activity. So the next step is to get the data out of the intent that we put in it in the other activity. And this is where that key, that static variable, comes into play. So to do that, we're going to get a string out of there and call it message text equals the intent that we just got, get string extra, and here is where we use that static variable. Now, back in the create message activity, I said that we could have just used X. We could have hard-coded X in there. If I would have done that, when I was retrieving it on this end, on the receiving end, I would have to do this. But that gets to be problematic, because what if I change it here and then I forget to change it over there? So that's the reason for these static final variables, is if I need to make a change there, we just make it to this static constant right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that static constant in there, extra message like that. But what this really is, it's a key that tells us which piece of data we want to pull out of the intent. So now that we've got the data from the intent, we need to actually stuff it into that text view that's in this activity. So the first thing we need to do is get a handle on that text view. So I'm going to create a variable that's of the text view type, and they call it message view equals text view, find view by ID, and what did we gave that an ID of message. Not sure what happened with my parentheses here. It should look like this, and then my semicolon at the end. Okay, so now we've got a handle on that text view, which is basically a label, and then we're going to set the text on that to the message text. So we'll go message view dot set text, and then we'll pass in there the string that we want to set it to, which is message text. Alright, now our app should be ready to run one more time, and we'll see how we can pass data from one activity to another by stuffing the data into an intent object. So let's go ahead and run this app. And this will be a lot quicker because my emulator is still up and running from the last time I ran it. So here's my emulator. Now I'm not so sure actually. Alright, so this is showing our previous version of the app before we ran it again. I got this pop-up window here asking me which emulator I want to run it on. I'll just click OK, and I'm going to go back over to the emulator itself, and you can see it's doing something here. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing, but I can see a lot of data flying through the console here, and here comes our app. Now here's the updated version running here. So if I go ahead and type something in here, ooh, you know what? You guys might run into this problem too, is my keyboard is not enabled. So I can't, oh, there we go. If I just click on that edit text, the edit view in here, then it'll pull up the keyboard here. But I was trying to type it in using the keyboard on my laptop, and you can't do that. I think you have to set the emulator up in a special way to do that, and I'll look into that and get back to you on it. So I'm just going to pass in 4 W's. So I'll hit send message here. Hopefully, and there you go. So we stuffed those 4 W's into our intent object back in the create message activity. Then we launched the intent. Android analyzed the intent and saw that we wanted to start the receive message activity. And in the receive message activity, we called get intent and grabbed the intent that was used to launch it. And then we pulled the data out of the WW or out of the intent. And you can pass lots of data in an intent, and that's the purpose of the key. So I think the book makes this pretty clear, but you could call put extra a whole bunch of times. So you could pass in like 4 or 5 strings or even other types of objects in the intent, but when you're pulling them out, you have to know which piece of data that you want to retrieve based on the key. And that's what we use that static constant for. That serves as the key here. Now the book goes on to have you do a few more steps so that you can actually send a message to, I think it's Gmail or some mail app. We're not going to do that at this point. We might do it soon or later. But the problem with that is you need to have an email app installed on your emulator, and that can be problematic. What you really need to do is run the app on a real phone. So for now, we're not going to do that, but we may come back to it, so don't hold me to that right now. The other thing I want to do is make sure you understand that whole process of intent resolution, which can be a little bit confusing, and I think I think we've had enough for videos with this one. I might make another short video, hopefully, just to explain what intent resolution is all about.